amazing group of kids. You're doing an amazing job. Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning. We are slightly fewer in number today, but we're going to be mighty in faith today. Amen. You know, it's Thanksgiving week, and that means a couple things around here. First of all, Thanksgiving Day at this church is just one of the greatest days of the year here. If you haven't experienced Thanksgiving Day here yet, try to carve out a little of your time on Thanksgiving Day to be here, because it's extraordinary. We serve a Thanksgiving meal that will rival any Thanksgiving meal I've ever had. All the turkeys and the stuffing, all the fixings, great homemade pies. But maybe most importantly, we serve that amazing meal to hundreds of people in this community, and we do it out of just pure love for Jesus. And I'm telling you, it transforms people. Amen. So we do that every Thanksgiving from 11 to 2. Even if you have a big family thing you have to go to, maybe you could stop by on your way and just hang out a little bit. It'll be a blessing to you. If you plan on being here that day, there's a sign-up sheet right back there at the Connect table. We'd ask you to please sign up, especially if you're going to serve, because we kind of need to know how many people to expect. Also today, there are on the Connect table, you know, we're coming up to the end of the year, and at the end of every year, we have nominations for new deacons and elders. And so if there's someone in this church, and you've been watching them, and you think they have the qualifications to serve as a deacon or elder, then you nominate them. Put their name on that form, turn it into one of the elders. Amen? Amen. You know, when I was a young man, I spent some time in the Boy Scouts, and I love the Boy Scouts. I loved the camping, I loved the uniforms, I loved the merit badges. Like, Boy Scouts was cool, man. That was fun stuff. But the Boy Scouts wasn't all about having fun. There were also a lot of things we had to learn. There were classes we had to take. There were things we had to study. And a lot of those classes and things we had to study were all about survival skills. In fact, the Boy Scouts even have this manual, the Boy Scout Manual, and it's filled with all these survival skills. Like what to do if you get bitten by a snake, or what to do if you get lost in the forest, or how to make a fire if you don't have any matches, you know, stuff like that, survival stuff. Well, when I got a little bit older, I enlisted in the United States Army. And the Army takes all that survival stuff to a whole nother level. And the Army also has these survival manuals. And these manuals teach you all kinds of survival stuff, like what to do if you get stuck behind enemy lines, how to find food, how to build shelter, how to stay hidden from the enemy, how to escape if you get taken prisoner, you know, survival stuff. Well, what those Boy Scout survival manuals and Army survival manuals are all predicated on is the idea that you never know what kind of situation you might find yourself in. And sometimes you might find yourself in a situation where your actions are the difference between life and death. Amen? Amen. And if you find yourself in a situation like that where it's life or death, you better know what to do, right? You got to know what to do. That's why the Boy Scouts have their survival manual. That's why the Army has their survival manual. And if you're wondering where I'm going with this, that's why we have our survival manual. Amen? The Holy Bible, the greatest story ever told, which happens to be the name of the sermon series we're going through right now. You see, the greatest story ever told, this is our survival manual. And this book is filled with all kinds of examples of what to do when you're facing extraordinary situations. Well, we're going to look at one of those extraordinary situations today. So in our journey through the greatest story ever told, we started at the very beginning, started in Genesis, and we've moved through the entire Old Testament. We're now in the very last section of the Old Testament. We're in the books of the prophets. Last week we spent a little time with the prophet Isaiah, and this week we're going to spend a little time with the prophet Daniel.
All right.
Now, Daniel was an Old Testament prophet of God, and he lived about 600 years before Jesus. And he lived during a very dark time in Israel's history. You see, Israel had been invaded by the Babylonians, and they swept across Israel, and all the Israelites that weren't killed were taken as prisoners. And then they were all taken away in exile to the pagan kingdom of Babylon. And they didn't know if they were ever going to see their homes again. So this is a very dark time in Israel's history. And Daniel, the prophet of God, is there in exile in Babylon. Well, while Daniel is in exile in Babylon, he becomes servant to the king of Babylon, a man named King Nebuchadnezzar. And King Nebuchadnezzar, he keeps having this dream. It's this recurring dream, just keeps happening, and he can't figure out what it means. And he just kind of starts obsessing over this dream. It's kind of driving him crazy. He can't figure it out. Well, in Daniel chapter 1, we're told that Daniel could understand visions and all kinds of dreams. So God has given Daniel this ability, and then Daniel uses this God-given ability to interpret that dream that the king keeps having. Like Daniel tells that king in very precise detail exactly what his dream means. And the king is so amazed with Daniel's ability that this pagan king actually starts praising the God of Israel.
Amen.
And then this happens. Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all its wise men. Moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon. Now, if you grew up in church, you've probably heard of these guys. Yeah. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This is one of those stories that we teach our children when they're still very young. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these are three faithful Israelite men. And they are also in exile in Babylon. And now, at Daniel's request, they are servants of the king along with Daniel. And so these four men, they have formed this faith community, you see. They've come together and they are holding on to God, and they're holding on to each other, and they're helping each other survive this trial. By the way, any survival manual will tell you that your odds of survival go way up when you're not alone. Which is one of the big reasons we come here every week. This is why we come together. And we form this faith community. And we hold on to God, and we hold on to each other, and we help each other survive the trials in this life. Amen? So Daniel and his three friends, they gradually rise in power. And And they've got the favor of the king. So even in exile, things seem to be going pretty well for them. But they're about to face a terrible ordeal. And they're going to need their survival manual, because their actions in this ordeal are going to mean the difference between life and death. So here's what happens next. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plains of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned all the provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image that he had set up. So, all the most powerful people in Babylon, they've all come together, and they're just waiting for this golden statue to be revealed. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "This is what you're commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." So just picture this scene. Hundreds of the most powerful people from all over Babylon, and they're all gathered around this giant golden statue. And then they hear the sound of that horn, and all those people immediately fall down and they start worshiping that statue. Because they know what's going to happen if they don't. And nobody in that crowd wants to be thrown into a blazing furnace, right? So everyone in that crowd is on their knees. Everyone, that is, except for 3 men.
Amen, amen.
Picture it, hundreds of people on the ground, and just these 3 men standing. And who are those 3 men? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. While everybody else is on the ground worshiping, these men refuse to worship that statue made of gold. Well, there's little doubt what's going to happen next, right? And at first, King Nebuchadnezzar can't believe that anyone would dare to defy his orders. He can't believe it. So he has these 3 men brought to him. And he gives them one more chance to bend their knee and worship that statue of gold. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I've set up? If you're ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?"
The God.
Amen.
So this is a life and death situation, right? And these guys are going to need to know their survival manual.
You got that right.
They're going to need to know what their survival manual says about this situation. And they do know what their survival manual says. Do you know what it says?
Yeah.
It says, "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not bow down to them or worship them." You're familiar with the 10 Commandments, right? Well, this is the very first one.
Oh, yeah.
This is the first commandment that God gives us. No other gods before me. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. It's the first commandment God gives. So while everybody in that crowd is on their knees, because they think survival depends on following the king's commandments. But these 3 guys are on their feet because their survival depends on following God's commandments. Amen? Everybody is on their knees in worship. These men are standing up in defiance. Because while everyone else is afraid of offending the king of Babylon, these guys are afraid of offending the king of heaven. And so there they stand. There they make their stand. So how were they able to do that? How were these men able to stand so strong in that life and death situation? Well, first of all, they knew who their God was, and they knew what their God had said.
Amen.
Amen? Two things. They knew exactly who God was, and they knew exactly what God said. And they trusted those things so much that they were ready to lay down their lives. So if the choice was burning or bowing to a false god, they chose burning.
Amen.
Because that is serious faith right there.
Oh, yes.
That is serious faith. You know, you may have heard me tell the story of Polycarp before. Polycarp was a leader in the Christian world in the Roman Empire about 100 years after Jesus. And it was a time of terrible persecution for Christians. And one day some Roman soldiers came and they arrested Polycarp. And they were going to execute him. They were going to put him to death for his faith. They were going to put him to death for teaching that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Well, the day comes for his execution, and the Roman soldiers bring him out, and there's this whole crowd of people gathered. They're all there to watch Polycarp burn. So these soldiers, they tied Polycarp up to this pole, and they stack all this wood and straw around his feet, and they're about to light that fire. But then the Roman governor speaks up, and he says to Polycarp, if you will only renounce your faith in this Jesus and worship Caesar, we'll untie you. You can go home and live peacefully. Well, Polycarp straightened up as best he could, and he looked his accusers right in the eye. And he said, Jesus has been faithful to me all my life, and I'll be faithful to him. Light the fire.
Amen.
And that's what they did. That's what they did. Guys, that's some serious faith right there.
Amen.
That is, and that's the same kind of faith that Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego had. And that faith, that's exactly the reason they were able to stand so strong in that life and death situation. It was their faith in God. You see, but I want you to see something about their faith. See, these guys didn't just have faith in God. They had faith in what God was capable of.
Yes.
Look again at that question King Nebuchadnezzar asked them. The king said, what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? You see what the king is asking them? He's saying, look, if I decide that your fate is in that fire, what God is powerful enough to stop me?
They know him. Oh, yeah.
Well, these three men answer that question in a most extraordinary way. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand."
Our God is able.
What's that song we sang this morning? Our God is able, right? And that's what he said. Our God is able to save us. Now, we just have to linger in these words for a moment and really think about this remarkable statement of faith these guys just made. Because they just told that king, look, Our God is able to save us from your fire. Our God can rescue us from danger. Our God can deliver us from your hand. Our God is able.
Yes, He is.
Nebuchadnezzar asked, what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? They say, ours will.
Amen.
Our God will. The God we serve is able. Amen. The God we serve is able. Look, you want to know how they were able to stand when everybody else was on their knees? There's your answer right there.
Yes. Our God.
They knew that our God is able.
Amen.
They knew that nothing is too difficult for our God. Nothing is impossible for our God.
Amen.
And my friends, that's a truth that gets repeated in the Bible over and over and over again. But let me tell you something. If the Bible says something once, you can take it to the bank.
Amen.
When the Bible repeats things over and over, you better pay special attention to that. And over and over and over, the Bible tells us how able our God is. In fact, very early in the Bible, God comes to this man, Abraham. Abraham's kind of an old guy. God tells him he's going to have a son. Abraham says, I'm too old to have a son. You know what God said? God said, is anything too hard for the Lord? Amen? Right? You know the story of Job, right? Job went through terrible suffering. Right in the middle of his suffering, Job said to God, I know that you can do all things. The prophet Jeremiah said, nothing is too hard for you. We come to the New Testament. An angel of God comes to this woman, Mary, says, you're going to give birth to the Son of God. Mary says, that's not possible. The angel says, nothing is impossible.
Nothing.
The Apostle Paul wrote a letter to the Ephesian church, said, our God is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine. Jesus himself said, with God, all things are possible.
Amen.
Over and over and over, the Bible repeats this truth. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they knew this.
Amen.
They knew that our God is able. So when King Nebuchadnezzar said, what God is able to rescue you from our hand? Those guys said, our God will. Our God, with the God we serve, is able. Amen. Amen.
Our God is able. Yes, He is.
You know, I'm afraid that sometimes we come here and we learn these great Bible stories. But then that's all we think of them as, just some stories that happened to some people a long time ago. And we don't really see how those stories can impact our lives right here and right now. Well, listen, this series is called The Greatest Story Ever Told. And every week in this series, the point I've tried to make is that the greatest story ever told is your story. The same thing that was able to make them stand so strong is the same thing that makes you able to stand so strong. The God that was able to rescue them is the same God that's able to rescue you. In fact, if we just went around this room, I'll bet every person here could tell the story of what our God is able to do. I bet every one of you. Listen, our lives tell the story that our God is able. Our lives right here in this room tell the story that our God is able to free us from addiction. Our God is able to heal broken marriages and heal broken hearts and heal broken bodies. Our God is able to pay the unpaid bills. Our God is able to forgive our darkest sins. Our God is able.
Hallelujah.
And these three men believed that with all their heart. They knew how able our God is, and so they refused to bow down and worship that golden statue. And they even tell that pagan king, look, if we're thrown into the burning furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it. That is serious faith. That's serious faith. Faith that their God could save them. But I want you to know that their faith in God didn't even stop there. It didn't stop with believing that God would miraculously save them. Their faith went much deeper than that. Remember what's happened to these guys. They saw their country invaded. They saw cities destroyed, their homes burned, their family and friends killed. Now they're living in exile in this pagan empire. You know, most people would have just given up on their faith at that time. But not these guys. Even in exile, they just keep trusting God, they keep serving God, they keep worshiping God, and they keep praying to God. And I'm pretty sure I know what some of their prayers were all about. For instance, I'm sure those guys prayed that God would just let them go back to their homeland. So far, that prayer hasn't been granted. And I'll bet you that when everybody else was on their knees and they were standing, I bet they prayed that nobody would notice. That prayer didn't get answered either. And now, I'll bet they're praying like crazy that King Nebuchadnezzar is going to change his mind and not put him in that furnace. Only that prayer is not going to be granted either. And now they're close enough to feel the flames. And they are about to die. And so far, God hasn't answered their prayers the way that they hoped He would. So what are they going to do? Are they going to give up on their God and worship this golden statue? No, they are not. Even after their prayers went unanswered, they just keep trusting God. See, some people, maybe some of us here, some people can have the kind of faith that just expects God to save them from every trial. But then those trials come, because trials always come. And if you have the kind of faith that just expects God to save you from every trial, then when those trials come, what happens to your faith? It just falls apart, right? When the trials come, your faith falls apart. But some people, and maybe some of us here, have the kind of faith that says, trials are going to come. And I'm going to have to go through those trials. But I don't have to go through them alone. God will be with me in those trials. God will help me stand up during my trials. See, and when you have that kind of faith, the trials can come and your faith won't fall apart. Why do I say that? Well, here's why. Because I'm sure those men really hoped that God was going to save them from this trial. But their faith was deep enough to know that God is still God, even if He doesn't save them from this trial. And so first they said, look, if we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it. But then they go on to say, but even if He does not, we want you to know, O King, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you set up.
Amen.
Well, that didn't sit well with the king.
Amen.
He becomes enraged. And he orders that that furnace be heated 7 times hotter than it already is. And then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown into that fire. And the king is just waiting and watching for them to be consumed by the flame. Only that's not what happened. They're standing in the middle of that fire. but they're not burning. And then, as the king watches in disbelief, he sees that there's actually a fourth man in that furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of God."
Amen, amen. Amen, amen.
Here's what we know.
Amen.
We know that those men were pulled out of the fire that day completely unharmed.
Didn't even smell like smoke.
That's what we know. And we know that King Nebuchadnezzar was so amazed that he got down on his knees and started worshiping the God of Israel. It started out, these guys were supposed to bow down and worship Nebuchadnezzar. Now it's Nebuchadnezzar on his knees worshiping the God of Israel. Amen? That's what we know. What we don't know is who the 4th man in that furnace really is. Now, most Bible scholars would tell you that it was Jesus himself in that fire. Others would say that it is an angel of God in that fire. You can ask God yourself one day. For now, who it was is not as important as what happened that day.
Amen.
And what happened that day was God proved one more time that He is able. Our God is able. Our God is able. And He who knows truly lives tell the story. Our God is able.
Yes, He is. When God says yes, nobody says no.
And I'll tell you this, if this sermon ended right here, I'd feel pretty good about the information I shared with you.
Amen.
But there is one more final, valuable lesson for us to take away from this. You see, when we pray to God in the face of our trials, we tend to pray that God would just spare us from the trials, right? Like, God, keep that trial away. Keep me out of the fire, God. Here's the final lesson for us to learn from this. Sometimes God saves you from the fire. But sometimes God saves you
In the fire. Amen.
And sometimes what God really needs to know is, can you face that fire and still hold on to your faith?
Amen. Amen.
You see, so many of us, we pray things like, God, if you'll just do this for me, then I'll have faith in you. God, if you'll just help me pay these bills, if you'll just get me through if the diagnosis from the doctor is good, God, if you'll just do this for me, then I'll have faith in you. That's not real faith at all. Real faith says, God, even if you don't pay the bills, even if the diagnosis isn't good, even when I'm standing in the fire, I will still love you. I will still worship you. No matter what may come, God, you will still be my God.
Amen.
Amen?
Amen.
Well, listen, we're going to have our time of invitation now. And I just want to ask you this. What's going on in your life right now that really needs to be taken care of? What really needs to get done in your life right now? What do you have to overcome? What battle? What enemy? What is it in your life right now? Because our God is able.
Yes, He is.
Our God is able. And you know, I know what's happening with a lot of you right now is when you think of what's that barrier, what's that obstacle in my life right now, you're thinking of physical stuff, you're thinking of worldly stuff, you're thinking of sickness or death, and that's fine. God's able to overcome that too. But I need you to know that the most urgent need in your life right now is not worldly, it's spiritual.
Amen.
The most urgent need in your life right now is to finally put that sin behind you.
Yes.
You know, that last one that you're still holding on to, you can't quite let go of. It's time to let go of it. And our God is able. And if you bring that sin right here today, I promise you can leave here today without it. And guys, this is urgent. Christ might come back tonight. So you can leave here with that sin and meet Christ with it. Or you can leave that sin right here and meet Christ without it.
Amen.
But this is urgent. And our God is able. And He's just waiting for you to come and talk.
Amen.
What do you need done in your life right now? Come talk to God about it. Come talk to our able God